Color holds important information about soils, so we'll want to do a good job of describing it. We could start off by just describing color using common English vocabulary. For example, the soil could be described as yellowish red. One problem with doing this, though, is there's a bit of ambiguity about just what yellowish red means. So, to get around this, what we'll do is use a standardized color description scheme. And the scheme that's usually used is the Munsell color chart. And that'll give us a way to unambiguously describe the soil. When we make the description, we should also note the moisture state of the soil, whether it's wet, moist, dry, and so on, because the moisture state will affect the color. Another thing that will affect the color is the physical state, whether it's intact or broken, whether the Peds are broken open, whether you've rubbed it between your fingers or crushed it. Some soils contain a variety of colors in particular patterns called mottles. So if the soil is mottled, we'll want to describe the various different colors of the mottle as well as the pattern. So the approach that we'll use is the Munsell color classification. It consists of three things: hue, value, and chroma. So we need to describe all of these in order to describe the color. The hue is the base color of the base color, like the red, green, yellow, blue, and so on. Those are hues. Value is the lightness or darkness, and chroma is the strength of the color. Now the hue, this will be described by giving the base color along with a number that indicates how that base color might be mixed with other colors. I'll show you an example of this in just a second. An important hue for soils is called gley, and gley is a bluish or greenish gray hue, and this is the kind of hue that occurs in soils with reduced iron, and it indicates poor drainage. Value is going to be important because it'll give us some indication about the oxidizing state. High values indicate oxidizing conditions, and low values indicate reducing conditions. Low values also will be indicative of the organic material that's present. So here's another look at hue, value, and chroma. These are examples of different hues: red, yellow, green, and so on. Most soils will be in red or yellow hues, and they often will contain a little bit of both. So there'll be a mixture of some red and some yellow, and so you'll see an indication, something like 2.5 YR. So the YR stands for yellow and red, and the 2.5 indicates that it's a mixture between the two. So we can describe the hue to get the base color. Now the chroma, we can think of chroma as, we can think of the color as being a mixture between the basic hue, the pure hue, and a gray tone, sort of a neutral gray tone. So here's an example of the base color, and here's a neutral gray tone. And these are mixtures of the two. And so the chroma would describe where along this scale we are. Where are we along the mixture of the pure hue and this base color? Now the value, that's going to describe what base color we're using. So the base color here would be a medium gray, but this base color could go could include really any shade of gray, from white to black. And the value then goes from light color, essentially white, to black. Okay, so by describing these three things, the base hue, what the value then gives us the shade of gray, that's this this neutral color, and then the chroma tells us how much of the neutral color and the hue we have, what percentage of each one's we have. So that'll be the general approach. This is a page from the Munsell color chart, and what we would do is take the soil and compare it to one of these, or compare it to all of these chips. There are many pages, and we would find the one that matches the best. So let's say we compare them and our soil matches that color chip the best. Well, the hue is given up here or over here. So this entire page consists of hues that are 2.5 YR. The value goes along this axis and the chroma goes along this axis. So remember, value goes from light to dark, and we can see a light shade here and a dark shade here. And chroma is a measure of the mixture between the light, between the neutral color, whether it's light or dark, and the hue. So chroma goes from on this end, this would be a small amount of the hue and a large amount of the neutral color, and then we get more strong proportions of the hue as we go in that direction. Okay, so that's how this color matrix is laid out. And then the way to determine what the color is that we've selected, well, the whole page is 2.5 YR, and the value is given right there, and the chroma is, well, given right here. So this would be, we'll describe it as hue value chroma. So that chip is 2.5 YR, and the value would be 6, and the chroma would be 6. Okay, and this one right here, that would be 2.5 YR, 7/3. Okay, so using this scheme, we can describe any one of these color chips unambiguously. So here's what the book looks like that has these color chips in it. You can tell this book has seen some use. This is the page that we were just looking at. Here's a page that has glade hues on it, and the glade hues, they look kind of like gray, but the word is not gray, it's gley, Gley, and they're gray. In this case, it looks like a bluish gray. And so we would use this for soils that have a gray color and that are probably indicative of reducing conditions, saturated conditions, and or high organic content. And here's just an example of a soil sample being compared to a soil chip. So here's some examples of modeled soils, and you can see that there are several different colors in these soils. What often occurs is that there's a base color, like a matrix color, and the models are splotches within that matrix. And so you would want to describe the color of the matrix as well as the color of the model. And in some cases there are multiple colors involved. In some cases there's a color that's at the center of the model, and there's a matrix color, and then there's a transition between the center of the model and the matrix. This is an example. You can see that there's this reddish color, that's the matrix, and then the center of the model is kind of this light whitish color, and then there's a yellow color that is kind of a transition. I guess one thing too, let me point out, let me go back here. So when we're using the Munsell chart, we can describe the soil color using this terminology. But in our notes, we would also want to just describe it using regular text. And so we can do that in a fairly unambiguous way by noting here that, let's see, this color corresponds to this location here, and we can get the color there. It's a light reddish brown. And if we move over to this one, that's going to be right here. That's described as light red. So the Munsell chart, it gives us this nomenclature for describing the soil, but it also gives us the correct English terminology for describing the soil in an unambiguous way. Okay, so what we would do then is describe these colors of the models using the Munsell description, and we can get the nomenclature for the matrix, the model, and the transition. And then when we're describing the model, we also want to describe the size and the shape of these splotches, as well as their fractional abundance. So these will be descriptors that will be in addition to the color. Now the Munsell color is going to be an important way to just communicate the color of the soil, but we can also use it as an indicator of the characteristics of the soil, or in this case, the speciation of the iron minerals. This is the Munsell hue, and this hue is indicative of this iron oxide mineral. And here's the formula. So as it turns out, the iron oxides have very distinctive colors, and the people have gone through and looked at the range of the hues that are presented by these colors. And in fact, these iron oxides are used as pigments in paint in many cases. And so they have these distinctive hues, and we can characterize the hue and then use that to estimate the species of the iron oxide that are present in the soil. So the plasticity of soil will be an important characteristic in identifying, or particularly for fine-grained soils. Plasticity is how resistant a soil is to deformation, how well it holds together, and the clay content is going to be largely responsible for plasticity in soils. So by characterizing the plasticity, we're really going to be characterizing the clay content. And the cylinder test that I had on the previous slide, that is going to be one way of characterizing the plasticity. And so basically what you do for these tests is that you deform the soil in a certain way, and you measure the response to the deformation. And usually you measure how small a piece can get, or how long a piece can get under a certain type of deformation. So that the rolling test is one way that you can do it. And here's a picture where soil, you put the soil into a ball and then roll it out on a flat surface. You could potentially roll it on the palm of your hand, but a flat surface is going to be better. And then what you do is you roll it out, and you determine the minimum diameter of a roll that you can make, of like a cylindrical roll that is self-supporting. And depending upon the size of that roll, you can determine the characteristic or the plasticity. And basically, the smaller size of cylinder that you can roll out that holds together and will support itself under its own weight, the smaller it is, the more plastic the soil is. Okay, so if you can form a narrow, long cylinder of soil and do this by rolling it, that's going to be more plastic than a smaller one. And the size, the diameters is 2 and 4 and 6 millimeter diameter cylinders give you the 3 scales of 3 degrees of plasticity. So this cylinder is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to make a ribbon out of the soil. And this is another way of deforming the soil and evaluating the effects of this deformation. So the strategy here is to take the soil and get a piece of soil that's about the size of a golf ball, perhaps a bit longer, or perhaps a bit bigger. I've also seen this done where the soil is rolled into a cylinder initially, and then you take it, and you can see this person has it in their hands, and then you kind of hold it in the palm of your hands, and you squeeze it out between your first finger and your thumb. So you squeeze it in the palm of your hands and kind of squirt it out, and then use your thumb to push it along, and you make a ribbon. So here's this person. Actually, I think that's my thumb pushing along this ribbon, and there the ribbon is that long. And here's a bit of a longer ribbon. You can see it goes from there to there. And so the ribbon is going out, and it's being loaded by its own weight. And so the stronger the soil is, the more plastic it is, the longer the ribbon you can have, because the longer it gets, the more load it's under, and the more stress that the ribbon is under. And so you do this process and kind of squirt out this ribbon, and well, you can see it's about 1 inch wide and maybe an eighth of an inch or so thick. And you squirt it out, and you measure the length that it gets before it breaks. And that length then is used to estimate the plasticity. Okay, so there's some other characteristics of the soil that should be noted. When the soil is obtained, is it dry, moist, or wet? Plasticity we talked about. And the cohesiveness, this is related to plasticity, and plasticity can be low, medium, or high, but cohesiveness is just either cohesive or non-cohesive. So cohesiveness really means does it stick together? And so in order to stick together, you need to have usually it's a bit of clay in there to hold things together. And so there are a couple of tests for this, but a simple one is you make this cylindrical roll, and if you can roll the soil into a 6 millimeter diameter cylinder, then it's cohesive. If you try to do that and the soil just falls apart, then it's non-cohesive. So 6 millimeters, that's 1/4 of an inch for those non-metric folks out there. Okay, so soils also develop a structure, and this is something that you really need to look at the soil in a soil pit, because the structure is developed over the scale of several centimeters or perhaps many centimeters. And the structure causes the soil to break into fragments that have a characteristic shape. Here are some examples. These are the typical soil structures: granular, blocky, platy, prismatic, and columnar. And these describe the shape of these units of soils called Peds. There's the term Ped. So processes within the soil, shrinking and swelling, perhaps some chemical processes, cause the soil material to break up and be bound by fractures or discontinuities or planes of weakness at the very least. So when you pick the soil up, it breaks into these characteristically shaped blocks. So here's a granular structure. This is a platy. You can see there's a fabric like this, and if you look at that in detail, you can see that these are like tabular blocks of soil. This is a blocky structure here, so the soil breaks into chunks that are roughly equidimensional, and then this is a prismatic structure. So those are all structures that are generally forming in the B horizon, and these are going to be different than sedimentary structures like bedding, cross bedding, that kind of thing. Those will be important, certainly, to describe, and that'll be a type of structure that could be in the soil or in the sediment. But then these granular blocky and so on, these kinds of structures are formed at much shallower depths when the soil when the soil forming processes are underway. So the soil structure will play a role in the permeability and how rapidly water can be transmitted through the soil. Granular structure and single grain structure. I guess I didn't point this out on the previous page, but one of the types of soil structures would be is a single grain structure, and if you just had loose sand, for example, that would be a single grain structure. And so these kinds of structures transmit water relatively easy. You have relatively high permeability. These structures, prismatic and blocky, you can see that it's intermediate permeability, and then a massive structure where there's really not a well-defined Ped structure, or platy structure where the Peds are really aligned horizontally. These will be relatively low permeability soils. Okay, the degree of weathering will be important. This is going to be indicated by, well, one of the aspects that will indicate this is the degree of mottling, and joining. Here's a picture of some models. You can see these different colors: the light tan or whitish color, the tan or brownish color, and then the reddish color. That's a mottled structure, and one of the things that models are often associated with is that you have say a tan and a red color, and those are indicative of oxidized iron. And then you often have patches that are grayish, perhaps a light gray, and this looks like it could be a fairly light gray. And light gray is really going to be indicative of either a leached out or perhaps a reduced iron. And so one thing that models can indicate is an area that is saturated intermittently. And when it's saturated, the pores are filled with water, and the soil is not really aerated. You're not getting air flowing through the pores. And so you can have anaerobic conditions or anoxic conditions, and a reduction of the oxygen content. And so you can have locally reducing conditions that cause the redox state of the iron to change, and if it's a reduced form of iron, then you can get these grayish colors. And then quite close by, you would have oxidized or oxic conditions, and there the iron would be red or orange colored. Okay, so one of the things that we'll do is work on coming up with these field classifications. So we'll do the soil description, and then based on that description, we'll come up with a classification and a name for the soil. And this is the slide that we saw before. So we go through and we do the description, and then we can take that information and come up with a name for the soil. So the USCS, or the Unified Soil Classification System, is shown here. And ultimately what we're going to try to do is give a two-letter designation to the soil. This would be the first letter, GSM, C, or O, depending upon whether it best meets these characteristics. And then we would have, following that, we would have one of these four letters. And we've got these two is the degree of grading or the degree of sorting. Poorly graded is well sorted or a uniform particle size, and well graded is poorly sorted and a wide range of particle sizes. And so the way it's going to work is that the gravel and sand fraction, if that's what you have, then the degree of sorting is going to be an important way to subdivide the coarse grain soils. And then the degree of plasticity will be how the finer grain materials are classified. And organic soils are going to be also classified using these second letters. Okay, so here's one type of flowchart for doing this. You say, well, is it coarse grain or fine grained? And then if it's coarse grained, is it gravel or sand? And if it's fine grain, silt and clay. Silt and clay, this is based on the liquid limit, and then the degree of the organic content, and this is largely determining what the plasticity is. And here this is then subdividing these categories based on the grading or the sorting. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The laminated sheet that I showed you earlier, on the flip side of that, it has the USCS soil classification scheme, and it's hard to read here, but this is going to kind of walk you through decisions on what size or which one of these symbols should be used. So you can see if it's coarse grain, you're up here, and if it's fine grain, you're down here. And if it's coarse grain, is it gravel or sand? And then if you've made that decision, then these decisions are looking at the type of grading and so on. So you take a look and make the decisions and divide it as best you can. The way that you would do this is by certainly when you're up here, you're going to be looking at this at the soils with your hand lens and looking at the grain size and using a comparator to estimate the grain size and estimate the distribution of the different grain sizes. And this is really just going to be a judgment call when you're doing it in the field, where you don't have access to the laboratory types of testing. And then down here, the fine grain estimates. This will also be based on the grading as well as the plasticity. And we saw the tests for plasticity, where you use a ribbon or you roll it between your fingers. Okay, so the USDA classification, this has fewer classes than the USCS, and I think it's a little bit more straightforward to do this. With the USCS, there are a lot of classes, and it can be difficult to decide between the two classes. So you tend to have a coarser level of classification when doing this in the field than what is actually shown on this diagram here that I showed previously. But with USDA, you should be able to follow this flowchart and determine what kind of soils you have. Really fairly straightforward. So what you do is you start with a soil sample, say about the size of a racquetball, and add some water and see if the soil holds together. So is it forming just kind of a cohesive clump? And adjust the water content. And if you do that and the soil isn't holding together, then you have a non-cohesive material or sand. And so then once you have some cohesion, then you go and do this test to see whether it forms a ribbon or not. Okay, and so if it has some cohesion, if it holds together, but you really can't form a ribbon with it, so you try to squirt out a ribbon and it just doesn't go anywhere, then there's what you got, a loamy sand. But if you can form a ribbon, then you have one of these three categories. So you go and you try to make that ribbon go out as long as you can, and probably do this a couple of times just to repeat it. And these different categories are based on how long the ribbon is before it breaks. So less than 2.5 centimeters, less than an inch, and 1 to 2 inches, and then this is greater than 2 inches. Okay, so once you've got which category you're in here, then you need to find out what the distribution of sand, basically the sand content in there. And so you take a little bit of the soil and put it in the palm of your hand, and get it wet, and kind of rub it in the palm of your hand. And so take your finger and of one hand and rub it on the palm of your hand of the other hand. And what you'll find when you add a bit of water, what you'll find is the soil breaks down, and you can feel the grittiness. So sand, you can feel sand grains in there as these relatively large grains. Clay just feels kind of buttery, and it doesn't really have an abrasive feel to it at all. And silt has an abrasive characteristic, but it's a very light abrasive feel, and you can't really feel the individual grains, but it feels just a little bit gritty. And so you can feel those different characteristics by rubbing on the palm of your hand, and then you need to make an assessment about whether, for example, if you're in this category, is it very gritty, or does it feel smooth or slightly gritty? And these are just judgments. And so, to a very real extent, you have to kind of calibrate yourself for whether this soil is very gritty or just slightly gritty. And so, to help you out with this, what we have is a set of soils that are that have been analyzed in the laboratory. So we know what the distributions are, and we know, for example, whether it's a silty clay loam or a silty clay. And so we're going to have you go through and do an exercise where you identify these soils, and you'll take your best guess at what they are by doing this analysis, and then you can check and see what it actually is, and try it again. If you need to go and redo it to get this calibration, basically a sense of what does it mean to be very gritty versus slightly gritty. One thing that I think you'll find when you do this is that when you first do it, just a fairly small fraction of sand tends to be quite striking, and so you can have a fairly small amount of sand in there that when you start to rub it on your palm, starts to really show up as being much grittier and a much higher fraction than it really is. And so having some experience with several different soils where you know what the material is, I think will help get you calibrated.